to travel to other worlds. Until recently, this seemed to be an impossibility. But great new discoveries have brought us to the threshold of a new frontier, the frontier of interplanetary space.
Welcome, everybody, to the very first episode of the Planet Ping Pong podcast, the podcast that's all about table tennis news, reviews, updates, and discussions. And I am your host, Andy. We're going to get to know each other a bit more later on, but just as a quick introduction to this podcast, I made this and I started this because when it comes to the world of sports, whether it's kickboxing, MMA, soccer, basketball, football, and so on, there's always a large quantity of podcasts, talk shows, TV shows that are dedicated to the specific sport. But when it comes to table tennis, it's really quite rare to find a piece of media like a talk show or a podcast or whatever dedicated to table tennis. Every once in a while, we will get like a small spotlight on ESPN or Sports Center or some of the larger shows, but it's really quite rare to see that. And so I'm making this podcast just to give the table tennis community a show for us to kind of discuss and to talk about whatever's going on in the table tennis world. So we're going to be going through a few segments, but the very first segment that we're going to be going into is the news segment. So let's get started with what's in the news in the table tennis world, or as I could say, the ping pong planet. Haha. But let's get started. So due to the coronavirus pandemic that's just kind of going around the world right now, it is quite a slow period for table tennis news. Obviously, due to the pandemic, there aren't really that many tournaments that are kind of going around at the moment, and even a lot of clubs around the world are just shut down for the moment. And so, at the moment, table tennis news is quite slow, but we do have a little bit to talk about. And so, just one thing right off the bat is that now that the coronavirus pandemic is getting better in some places, some gyms and some clubs are starting to open up again, especially in Europe, where we see clubs like Hungary and Greece are some of the earlier clubs to start opening up again, which is really good so that the athletes can actually get back to the gym and start training again. I know that in the US, some places are starting to open up for like these smaller lessons, perhaps for like a select few league members or something like that. But for the most part, most gyms are still closed except the ones in Hungary and Greece. And even those are still opening up in quite a limited fashion. Like I said, they're not really allowing for the entire club to come in and practice all the time. They're really only allowing some of the higher ranked league members to come in and practice. But at least it's good to see that the coronavirus pandemic is starting to slow down in some places, allowing for table tennis to grow again and to kind of go back into its gears. Like, for example, a lot of table tennis tournaments around the world have just been delayed or straight up canceled until either later this summer or later in the year, especially with, the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, which were set to be going down in just a few months, I believe, but they are now happening in 2021. And so finally, at least it's a good thing that some clubs in Europe are starting to open up again. And you know what? I'm not sure if China has reopened. I want to say yes, but maybe it is still a case of just allowing some of the higher ranked kind of like professional league players to come back and train. But at least that's a good thing. The next piece of news is that today, just a few hours ago, there was a press release for investors and stakeholders relating to the WTT, the World Table Tennis Organization, or whatever it's called. You know what I mean. But I think the WTT is a really interesting point of discussion because it really looks like they're trying to kind of fix a lot of the kind of problems that table tennis is facing as a sport right now, especially when it comes to quality of streaming and kind of event structure and stuff like that. I think it's a really good idea for the WTT to come in and provide like a higher level of quality for a video, especially for the people watching it. Because I know this is a big complaint for everybody in the table tennis community, but we've all been through this where we go on the ITV website looking up for the latest stream or the newest tournament or whatever, and we click on the live stream, but the quality looks like it's something from 2002 when it's like the 2019 China Open or something like that. The quality isn't as consistent with ITV, but I'm really happy to see that WTT is coming in and trying to fix a lot of that and also give prize like a huge amount of money for the winners of these WTT tournaments. And so I think it's a really good idea. But of course, we still don't know too much. I still have a few, I don't know, concerns, I could say, about the WTT. I'm not looking at it in any negative light or anything like that. I'm just saying that until we actually get to see a live WTT event go down, I'm gonna look at it with a grain of salt, like I think everybody should. But that's another piece of news. Just that the WTT CEO has released a press release for, like, your shareholders and your stakeholders for its inaugural event coming up in 2021. But now that we got through the news segment, we're actually going to come in and look at the meat of this episode. We're going to be looking at a kind of deep dive or semi deep dive of the top 10 rankings of the ITTF at the moment. I believe the rankings are still frozen from April 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic going on in the world. So, of course, the pandemic isn't going to be affecting the world rankings in any way aside from them being frozen until we can start getting these new tournaments back up and running. But because this is the very first episode of the Planet Ping Pong podcast, I just kind of want to go through the top 10 rankings for both men and women and just kind of talk about some of the more prominent figures that we have in those rankings, especially for the people who aren't as into the world of table tennis as some of the more hardcore fans. But let's get started. And so, looking at the top 10, we have Fan Zhendong, Xu and Ma Long taking spots 1, 2, and 3 in the men's seniors rankings. I want to kind of start off looking at these three players specifically, and then we'll go and talk about some others. But especially Xu Xin, Fan Zhendong, and Ma Long, I think are really interesting characters. Xu Xin, I think, is really interesting, and I think a lot of people will agree with me because he's a pen holder in a kind of time where it is very much dominated by shake hand players. Pen holders are a bit of a dying breed. There's not that many at the top level, as well, at least not as much as we did before. Of course, over history, we've had guys like Wang Hao, Yu Sung Min, and Ma Lin, of course. But Xu Xin is really kind of one of the last ones. At least I don't believe there's anybody else in the top 20. At least nobody that's coming to mind at the moment. But I think it's such a flashy style, and I'm surprised we don't have as many pen holders in the top rankings because you can get some really crazy power from that forehand. Xu Xin is known as the Cloud Walker because the mixture of his footwork and that strong forehand just makes him go just shred through some of the players in the top rankings. So I wish we had more pen holders in the top rankings. Hopefully, there's going to be a resurgence coming up in the next few years. I have seen some pen holders playing in the lower levels in like the maybe regional and national circuits over in Europe, which is actually really interesting. But I hope we get to see more pen holders coming up. Aside from Xu Xin, of course, we have Fan Zhendong, who's currently ranked at number 1. I think Fan Zhendong is a really interesting case because he's very young. He's only about in his mid 20s, maybe early to mid 20s, but he has been ranked number 1 more than once, which is crazy to think because he's playing against these guys like Xu Xin, Ma Long, Timo Boll, who are in their 30s or around their 30s, and Fan Zhendong is still consistently winning. He might not always win when he's playing against guys like your Malong or Shushin, or sometimes I believe he's lost a few times to Ovcharov. I might be wrong, but it's just crazy to see that he's beating all these guys who have a lot of experience on him, and he's getting ranked number 1 time and time again. It's really interesting to see because I wonder how his later years are going to be like, if he's going to stay at that level or if he's going to be kind of dipping back down. Which brings me to another topic that I kind of wanted to talk about, and that's the kind of, I don't know, the weird presence that the Chinese team has in the top 10 rankings. Because when you look at players like Timo Boll and especially Vladimir Samsonov, it's weird because they aren't really young anymore, but they have been consistently in the top 20 at least for more than 10 years, sometimes 15, sometimes 20. Look at Samsonov. I believe he's somewhere in the top 20, but he's still beating a lot of these young players that are coming up. And you don't really see that as much with China. What happens a lot with China is that you have these select handful of players that just out of nowhere just skyrocket up the rankings. You'll see them get to like number 3, number 4, number 9, and then out of nowhere, they just kind of fall down into the lower rankings. A perfect example of this would be Fang Bo. I remember in about 2016, Fang Bo suddenly just skyrocketed to number 9, jumping up like 20 places, and he stayed competitive in the top 10 for quite a while. But then, out of nowhere, just as quickly as Fang Bo shot up to number 9, he just kind of fell and dropped to number 20, number 30, number 40. And I don't even think that Fangbo is really competing anymore. And you can kind of see this in the women's circuit as well. Of course, we've had players like Ding Ning stay at the top 10 since a few years, maybe 5, maybe around like 7 years at the top 10 point. But we also have players like Mu Zhu, I believe, who also had a very similar case to Fangbo, where out of nowhere she just kind of shot up to like number 14 just for a few months, and then as quickly as she came up, she came down. I think it's really interesting because that's a steep contrast to the rest of the world, where those who reach the top 10 or ranks kind of close to the top 10 tend to stick around for a longer amount of time. You can even look at this with guys like Jun Mizutani, who he has been ranked about top 3, top 2, I believe. He's an Olympian, and though he's not as high in the rankings anymore, you can still see him being competitive around the top 20 mark. But you don't really see that as much with China. They shoot up and then just as quickly they shoot down, unless you're like a player like Shushin, Ma Long, Zhang Jiku, Ma Lin, Fan Jingdong, and so on. Those who actually reach like the top 3 stick around for a lot longer, but for whatever reason, unless you go to that number 1, 2, or 3 spot, then you just kind of shoot all the way back down, which kind of makes me think about where Lin Gaoyuan is going to be in a few years. Of course, at the moment, according to the 2020 April rankings, Lin Gaoyuan is ranked number 5. He just moved back down from being ranked number 4, but it makes me think about where Lin Gaoyuan is going to be in the next coming months or next few years. Is he going to stick around like Shushin, Ma Long, and Fan Zhendong, or is he going to suffer through the same fate that Fang Bo has had of going to ranked number 9, ranked number 7, 5, 4, and then just out of nowhere just shooting down to obscurity? I hope Lin Gaoyuan sticks around for a really long time because I really like his style of play, but we'll have to wait and see. Of course, in rank number 4, the person who took Lin Gaoyuan's ranking is Harimoto Tomokazu from Japan, one of the youngest players in the kind of senior professional circuit at the moment, and I think he's really one of the most important players to be looking at right now because he might actually have the key of breaking through that barrier of Chinese dominance that we have seen in the top 3 for the past few years. Of course, we've had guys like Timo Boll, Dima, Samsonov to a certain extent, and Mizutani kind of just shooting back and forth in between the top 5, top 10. But I think Harimoto really is one of the players to be looking at because I think he is one of the players that could actually come up and perhaps start replacing some of those top level ranked positions that the Chinese have dominated for so many years. Of course, we've had players like Timo Boll who have come up and have beaten a lot of these high level Chinese players. But now that Timo's kind of starting to get a little bit older, we need to start looking at who's going to be the next player to come up and retake the number 1 throne from the Chinese team because they have been so dominant. Especially if you look at the women's top 10 rankings, China seems to be even more influential. Out of the top 10 position, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the 10 positions. That's crazy. Especially because right now, Mima Ito, who's also in a pretty similar position to Harimoto Tomokazu, has actually taken the number 2 spot. I think Harimoto and Ito, I think, are going to be really important players in the next few years because they're still developing and they might actually break that barrier of Chinese dominance. I'm really looking forward to seeing their development, and I think the Olympics are going to be a very important time for table tennis, more so than the London and Rio Olympics, because this Tokyo 2021 Olympics, this might be the time where we see perhaps another country actually take the championship. I think that would be really interesting, and I think the most important players to be looking at right now are Harimoto and Ito. I will say, though, that I think a lot of players from Japan are going to be really important in the next few years, especially other players like Yu Hirano and Hina Hayata, because they're still developing. And we might see them come up and start a new era of international table tennis where the Chinese might not be dominating as hard as they have been before. Especially now that some players like Ishikawa, Mizutani, and Ai Fukuhara has already retired. Next few years for Japanese players are going to be extremely important because the new generation is coming up and we might see some pretty spectacular things coming from them. Another thing that I want to mention in the top 10s in the men's division is that we have Hugo Calderano at ranked number 6. I'm a big fan of Calderano from Brazil, and his top ranking, his highest position, has just been achieved at number 6. I think it's really important that Calderano is at number 6 because he is kind of showing perhaps the growth of table tennis in areas outside of Europe and Asia. Latin America has always had a pretty small presence in the world of international rankings of table tennis. We have had some pretty good players coming up here and there, but I think Calderano is really one of the first players from Brazil and just kind of South America in general to kind of come up and compete at the highest level in the top 10. I think Calderano is really kind of a good representation of the growth of table tennis in the world. We're starting to see a larger presence from other countries outside of Asia and Europe kind of starting to come up. We have players from Puerto Rico who are starting to come up in the youth circuits, and we also have the US, which is actually starting to pick up a bit of steam. I believe Lily Zhang is about ranked numbered like 26 or something like that. And it's really rare for the US to have a ranking that high. And so I'm really excited to see where table tennis goes from here, especially after the Tokyo Olympics, because we might start seeing a new wave of players from around the world kind of pick up steam and perhaps mix up the rankings a bit more. Canada doesn't really have that much of a table tennis scene, and so I believe for North America, the development of table tennis lies more in the US and Mexico, but I think it's going to be growing in the next few years. Table tennis, especially with the introduction of the WTT, really looks like it's starting to look at a new era. A new era where countries outside of Europe and Asia might actually come up and be competitive in the top 10 rankings. I'm really excited to see the development in Brazil, especially because of Hugo Calderano, but I'm also really interested to see how Sweden is actually starting to make a bit of a comeback. Of course, we have had Jan Ove Waltner, of course, and we've had players like Pargarel being quite competitive, but Matthias Falk, who is currently ranked number 9, might represent again the era where countries like Sweden might be coming back up and perhaps being as competitive as Sweden was during the times of Jan Ove Waldner. I'm really excited to see where WTT takes this world of table tennis. And with that being said, I think that's a good place to just kind of leave it for now. Of course, we're going to be touching more in depth on some of these topics in future episodes, but just because this is the very first episode of the Planet Ping Pong podcast, just kind of wanted to keep things short. And so the next segment that I want to start, we won't be able to go too hard into it today, but the next segment is the letters segment. So if you have any questions or comments or any point of discussion that you'd like to make, please feel free to leave a comment down below, or you can actually send a letter or a question to galaxytabletennis@gmail.com so that you can get in touch. And I want to perhaps bring on some guests on the show as well so that we can have a bit more of an actual discussion on the podcast instead of you guys just listening to me. But like I said, this is the very first episode of Planet Ping Pong, and I'm really excited to see where this podcast goes because I would just want to make an environment where people can share their thoughts and we can have like an actual discussion and perhaps grow the sport of table tennis through, podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff like that. Of course, I'm Andy, and if you guys can come up with a cool outro or like a slogan or anything, hit me up again at galaxytabletennis@gmail.com. Of course, you can also follow me on Instagram again at galaxytabletennis if you want to see more content. And if not, well, I guess I'll just see you guys next time. Of course, I mentioned that this, because it's the first episode, it's only going to be just about 20 minutes, but my goal is to kind of keep the show within 20 to about 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. But of course, we're going to see as we go. But of course, thank you for listening to the very first episode of the Planet Ping Pong podcast, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.